The stars had always called to humanity, and in the year 2187 they finally answered back. Commander Jack Morrison stood frozen on the bridge of the exploration vessel Horizon as the communications array erupted with signals that were clearly not random cosmic noise. His hands gripped the railing so hard his knuckles turned white. The communications officer, a young woman named Amy Sullivan, turned to him with wide eyes and simply nodded. This was it. This was the moment every human being had dreamed about since they first looked up at the night sky and wondered if anyone else was out there. The signal took 3 days to fully decode, but when it did, the message was clear and impossible to misunderstand. There was a Galactic Council, a massive organization of 47 different alien species that controlled 3 entire galaxies. They had been watching Earth for the past 60 years, ever since humans had detonated their first atomic bomb. That explosion had sent ripples through subspace that every advanced civilization could detect. It was like lighting a signal, fire that announced to the universe that a new species had reached the atomic age and would soon be reaching for the stars. The message welcomed humanity to what they called the greater cosmic community, but the welcome felt cold and calculated rather than warm and friendly. Ambassador Velthar of the Quarian Dominion, who appeared to be the spokesperson for this first contact, explained through the translation software that humans would be granted observer status in the council. They could attend meetings, they could listen to debates, they could even offer opinions when asked. But there was one rule that seemed strange and arbitrary. Humans were explicitly forbidden from forming any kind of military alliance or political partnership with any member species of the council. Captain Lisa Grant, a career diplomat who had spent 20 years negotiating treaties between Earth nations, was chosen to represent humanity at the council station. She was a calm woman in her late 40s with sharp eyes that missed nothing and a mind that could see 3 steps ahead in any negotiation. When her shuttle approached the council station orbiting the neutron star Kepler 442, she had to remind herself to breathe. The station was the size of Earth's moon, a massive construct of metal and crystal that housed billions of beings from species she had never imagined could exist. The council chamber itself was breathtaking. The room was circular and vast, with representatives from each species sitting in elevated sections that spiraled up toward a domed ceiling that displayed a real-time map of the known universe. Lisa walked to the human section, a small platform near the bottom that made it very clear where humanity stood in the galactic hierarchy. She wore a simple blue suit that represented Earth's unified government, and she carried no weapons or technology that might be seen as threatening. Ambassador Velthar was tall and thin, with skin that shimmered like oil on water and eyes that had no pupils but seemed to see everything anyway. His voice came through the translator as smooth and calm, but Lisa could sense something underneath it. Not hostility exactly, but something close to nervousness. When she finally had the chance to ask why humans faced this alliance restriction, the entire chamber fell silent. Thousands of alien beings turned to look at her, and she felt the weight of their attention like a physical force pressing down on her shoulders. Velthar took a long moment before responding, and when he did, his words were careful and measured. He explained that the council had studied human history extensively. They had watched human wars, analyzed human art and music, read human literature and philosophy. They had built psychological profiles of humanity as a species, and what they found had concerned them deeply. Humans, he said, displayed patterns that were dangerous when combined with advanced technology and access to other civilizations. Lisa pressed him for specifics. What patterns? What danger? Were humans more violent than other species? Were they more aggressive or territorial? Velthar exchanged glances with other council members, and Lisa noticed that several species seemed uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Finally, he admitted that human violence was actually average compared to other species. Some races in the council had far bloodier histories. Some were still working through conflicts that had lasted thousands of years. No, the problem with humans was not their violence. The problem was something else entirely, something the council called adaptive volatility. The term meant nothing to Lisa, and she said so. Velthar tried to explain. Most species, he said, reached a point of equilibrium in their development. They found a social structure that worked, a set of values that maintained stability, a way of life that could continue indefinitely without major changes. Once a species reached this equilibrium, They tended to maintain it for thousands or even tens of thousands of years. Change happened slowly and carefully. Innovation was incremental. Society became predictable. But humans, Velthar continued, had never reached equilibrium. Throughout their entire recorded history, they had been in constant flux. Governments rose and fell within single lifetimes. Social values shifted dramatically from one generation to the next. Technology advanced at an exponential rate that showed no signs of slowing down. Humans seemed almost addicted to change, even when that change was uncomfortable or dangerous. And more concerning, humans had a cultural tendency to celebrate this trait. Their stories glorified rebels and revolutionaries. Their heroes were often people who refused to accept the status quo and fought to change it. Lisa listened to all of this and felt something strange rising in her chest. It took her a moment to recognize the feeling as pride mixed with anger. She stood up from her seat, which was apparently against protocol because several council members made sounds of surprise and disapproval. She looked directly at Velthar and asked the question that needed to be asked. Was the council afraid of humanity? Not afraid that humans would attack them or conquer them, but afraid of what human ideas and human culture might do if allowed to spread freely throughout the galaxy. The silence that followed her question lasted for almost a full minute. Then Velthar did something that his species apparently rarely did. He admitted the truth. Yes, he said simply, the council was afraid. They had built a civilization that had lasted for millennia, precisely because they had learned to value stability over growth, predictability over innovation, peace over progress. And then humans had appeared, a species that valued all the opposite things, a species that seemed to thrive on chaos and change. The council feared that contact with humans, especially military or political alliances, would destabilize everything they had carefully built. Lisa returned to Earth with this information, and the response was exactly what she expected. Politicians were outraged. Military leaders saw it as an insult. Scientists were frustrated at being denied access to thousands of years of accumulated knowledge. But one person saw something different in the situation. Dr. Henry Blake was a xenoanthropologist who had spent his career studying how different human cultures interacted and changed each other. When he heard about the council's reasoning, he started laughing. His colleagues thought he had lost his mind, but Henry explained his reaction simply. The council had just admitted that they saw humanity as a threat not to their existence, but to their comfort. They were not quarantining Earth to protect themselves from human weapons. They were quarantining Earth to protect themselves from human ideas, and that Henry realized meant that human ideas had power in this galaxy. More power perhaps than any weapon could ever have. The Council's restriction might have been absolute in their eyes, but the galaxy was a big place with a lot of species who did not always follow the rules. The Krivali were one of those species, and they had built their entire civilization on the principle that rules were really just suggestions that could be negotiated around if you were clever enough. They were amphibious traders who operated on the edges of council space, selling goods and information to anyone who could pay. Their ships were small and fast, designed to slip in and out of systems before authorities could catch them. Sophie Martinez had been trading with the Krivali for 5 years before first contact happened, and she had earned their respect by being just as clever and just as willing to bend rules as they were. She was a human merchant who had left Earth in one of the early colony ships, and she had made her fortune by understanding that the universe ran on trade more than it ran on laws. When the Krivali heard about the Council's ban on human alliances, their merchant prince, a large green-skinned being named Torvik, immediately saw an opportunity. If the Council did not want humans in their club, then the Krivali would be happy to work with humans outside the club. Sophie brought the proposal to Earth's government herself, landing her ship in Geneva, where the Unified Earth Administration had its headquarters. General Paul Henderson, the security advisor who had spent his entire career preparing Earth for potential alien threats, met with her in a conference room that had been specially shielded against surveillance. Sophie laid out the proposal simply. The Krivali would provide humans with technology, star charts, and information about council politics. In exchange, humans would provide the Krivali with something they desperately needed, which was creative soul. Solutions to problems that the Krivali had been trying to solve the same way for centuries. Paul was suspicious at first because his job was to be suspicious of anything that seemed too good to be true. But Sophie showed him examples of what this partnership could mean. The Krivali had faster-than-light communication technology that was 3 generations ahead of what humanity currently used. They had medical scanners that could diagnose diseases before symptoms appeared. They had manufacturing techniques that could produce materials stronger than anything Earth could make. And most importantly, they had detailed information about how the Council actually operated, including all the unwritten rules and political games that no one ever explained to new species. The partnership began quietly through carefully worded trade agreements that technically did not violate the Council's ban because they were purely commercial arrangements. No military cooperation, no political treaties, just business between independent parties. The Council knew this was happening but could not prove it crossed any lines they had established. The Krivali were very good at staying just barely on the right side of legal. Lieutenant Kyle Brennan was a young officer in Earth's Space Defense Initiative who got assigned to work with Krivali engineers on upgrading human ships. He was 26 years old and had graduated top of his class in both engineering and tactical operations. His superiors chose him for this assignment because he had shown an unusual ability to think outside standard procedures, which was exactly what they needed when working with alien technology that did not follow any of the rules Kyle had learned in school. The first thing Kyle noticed when he started examining Krivali technology was how old it was. Not old as in broken or outdated, but old as in unchanged for a very long time. The designs were elegant and efficient, but they were also exactly the same as designs that had been used for hundreds of years. When Kyle asked the Krivali engineer he was working with, a female named Sarix, why they had not improved these systems, she looked at him with confusion. Why would they improve something that already worked perfectly fine? Kyle tried to explain the human concept of innovation for its own sake, of always looking for better ways to do things even when the current way was adequate. Sarix found this concept completely bizarre. Kyle reported his findings to Commander Rachel Torres, his direct superior, and a veteran officer who had been in space longer than Kyle had been alive. Rachel was a practical woman who cared more about results than theory, and she immediately understood the implications of what Kyle was telling her. If the Council's technology had stagnated, then humans might be able to catch up faster than anyone expected. Earth was centuries behind the Council in terms of raw technological power, but Earth was still innovating at full speed while the Council was barely moving forward. Meanwhile, on the Council station, Lisa Grant was discovering that not everyone agreed with the ban on human alliances. She started receiving coded messages from representatives of other species, requests for private meetings that had to be arranged in ways that would not attract attention from Council security. The first species to reach out were the Kirax, an insectoid race that had joined the Council only 200 years ago and still remembered what it felt like to be the outsiders. Their representative, a being that communicated through clicking sounds translated into text, explained that the Kirax had been watching humans carefully and saw in them a kindred spirit of sorts. The Lumens were next, a crystalline species that lived inside structures they grew from silicon and light. They had been part of the Council for over 1,000 years, but they had grown frustrated with how slowly things moved. The Lumens were scientists and artists by nature, and they felt stifled by the Council's conservative approach to everything. They wanted change, but the Council's structure made change almost impossible because every decision required consensus from all 47 member species. Lisa met with these representatives in secret locations throughout the station, usually in maintenance sections or cargo areas where security did not monitor as closely. She learned that there was a significant minority of Council species who were unhappy with the current system, but felt powerless to change it from within. The ban on human alliances had actually made things worse for these species because it had removed the one potential catalyst for change that might have shaken up the Council's rigid structure. Back on Earth, Dr. Henry Blake was analyzing all the information coming in from these various sources. He built a detailed model of Council politics and came to a conclusion that he presented to Earth's leadership. The Council was not as unified as they pretended to be. In fact, the ban on human alliances was probably a compromise position that barely passed the Council vote. There were species who wanted to completely isolate humanity, species who wanted to welcome them fully, and species who just wanted to maintain the status quo. The ban was the middle ground that everyone could agree to, but it satisfied no one. General Paul Henderson took this information and started planning. If the council was divided, then the ban could be challenged. Not through military force, because Earth would lose that fight badly, but through careful diplomacy, through building relationships with sympathetic species, through proving that humans could be trusted as partners rather than feared as disruptors. It would take time and patience, but it was a strategy that could work. Then the council discovered the unauthorized meetings and everything changed. Security forces raided one of Lisa's secret meeting locations and found her with representatives from 4 different species, all engaged in what the council classified as conspiracy to violate the alliance ban. Velthar himself appeared at an emergency session and issued an ultimatum directly to Lisa. All human diplomatic activity beyond official council business must cease immediately. All secret communications with other species must stop. Earth must accept its observer status and stop trying to build alliances, or face complete isolation from galactic civilization. Lisa stood in the council chamber with thousands of alien beings staring at her, and she knew that her next words would determine humanity's future in the galaxy. She could apologize, could promise to follow the rules, could accept the limitations the council wanted to impose, or she could do what humans always did when someone told them what they could not do. She looked at Velthar and said simply that humanity would not stop building relationships with other species. The council could ban alliances all they wanted, but they could not ban friendship, could not ban trade, could not ban the natural tendency of intelligent beings to work together when they found common cause. The chamber erupted in chaos, with some species calling for immediate sanctions against Earth and others defending humanity's right to engage freely with whoever they chose. Velthar called for order but could barely be heard over the noise. The ban on human alliances had been created because the council feared what humans might do. Now that fear was starting to become reality, and the council had no idea how to respond because nothing like this had happened in 3,000 years of galactic civilization. New Terra was everything humanity had dreamed about when they first looked up at the stars and imagined living on other worlds. The planet orbited a stable yellow star in the Epsilon Eridani system, and after 5 years of terraforming work, it had breathable air and liquid water and plants that had been brought from Earth. 16,000 humans lived there now, along with 3,000 aliens who had come despite the Council's warnings. There were Krivali merchants, Kirax scientists, Lumen artists, and members of a dozen other species who had decided that the Council's rules mattered less than the opportunities they saw in working with humans. Governor Mike Santos had been elected to lead the colony 2 years ago, and he had built his entire platform on the principle that New Terra would be a place where any being could come and build a new life, regardless of what their government said about it. Mike was a former construction engineer who had left Earth because he was tired of committees and regulations telling him what he could and could not build. On New Terra, if you had an idea and could convince others to help you make it real, you could do it. The colony was chaotic and messy and absolutely alive with energy in a way that most council worlds had not felt for centuries. The council fleet arrived on a Tuesday morning without any warning. 300 warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the star system, and every sensor on New Terra immediately started screaming alerts. Mike was eating breakfast with his wife and 2 children when his communication device started buzzing with emergency signals. He kissed his family and told them everything would be fine, even though he had no idea if that was true. Then he ran to the colony's command center where his entire staff was already gathering. The message from the council fleet was simple and direct. All non-human residents of New Terra had 24 hours to evacuate the planet. All human residents had 48 hours to pack essential belongings and prepare for transport back to Earth. The colony would be dismantled, the terraforming equipment would be confiscated, and the Epsilon, an Eridani system, would be placed under council quarantine. Earth was to immediately and publicly sever all unofficial alliances and accept permanent observer status with no possibility of future membership in the council. If these demands were not met, the fleet would enforce them by whatever means necessary. Mike read the message 3 times to make sure he understood it correctly. Then he started laughing in a way that made his staff look at him with concern. He explained that he was laughing because the council had just made the biggest tactical mistake possible. They'd given humanity an ultimatum in a situation where humans would never back down, and now both sides were locked into a confrontation that neither side probably wanted, but neither side could avoid. Chief Engineer Dana Foster was responsible for keeping New Terra's infrastructure running, and she immediately started calculating how long the colony could hold out if the Council actually attacked. Dana was a short woman with permanent grease stains on her hands and a mind that could look at any system and see exactly how it could be improved. She had been working with Krivali engineers for the past year on some experimental projects that the Council would definitely not approve of, and now those projects might be the only thing standing between New Terra and destruction. The colony's shields were designed to protect against solar radiation and micrometeorites, not military-grade weapons. The mining equipment was powerful, but never meant to be used as weapons. The communication array could reach Earth, but Earth was 4 light-years away and any help would take time to arrive. Dana ran the numbers and realized that New Terra could survive maybe 6 hours of sustained bombardment before the shields failed. After that, the colony would be defenseless. But Dana also knew something the Council probably did not know. Humans and Krivali working together had created some technology that was genuinely new, not just improvements on existing designs but completely novel approaches to old problems. The mining lasers, for example, had been modified with Krivali power systems and human targeting software. They could now track and hit objects moving at orbital velocities. The shields had been reinforced with a layering technique that Dana had invented by combining human materials science with Krivali energy field theory. And the colony's power generation system had been upgraded to output 3 times its original capacity, which meant they had energy to spare for systems the Council would not expect. Mike Santos refused to comply with the Council's demands, and he made that refusal public on every communication channel New Terra had access to. He transmitted a message that went out to Earth, to the Council station, to every colony and outpost within 100 light-years. He said that New Terra was a free colony that recognized no authority except the will of its residents. The people who lived there, human and alien alike, had chosen to build something together. They had chosen to ignore the Council's fear-based policies. They had chosen friendship and cooperation over isolation and suspicion. And they would not abandon what they had built just because the Council was uncomfortable with it. On Earth, the government faced the hardest decision in human history. President Allen Hughes convened his cabinet in an emergency session that lasted 14 hours. The military wanted to send ships immediately. The diplomatic corps wanted to negotiate. The scientists wanted more time to study the situation. Everyone had an opinion, and almost all of those opinions contradicted each other. Allen listened to all of them, and then made a decision that he knew would define his presidency, and possibly define humanity's entire future in the galaxy. Colonel Kevin Shaw commanded Earth's carrier fleet, which consisted of 12 ships that had been built over the past 5 years, using a combination of human engineering and smuggled alien technology. Kevin was a career military officer who had fought in Earth's last major war 20 years ago, and he understood something that many politicians did not understand. Sometimes you had to be willing to fight even when you knew you might lose, because the alternative was accepting that you would never be free to make your own choices. The 12 ships that Earth sent to New Terra were crewed entirely by volunteers. Every person on those ships knew they were flying toward overwhelming enemy forces. Every person knew they might not come back. But every person also knew that if they did not go, then humanity would be accepting permanent second-class status in the galaxy. They would be admitting that the Council was right to fear them, right to isolate them, right to treat them as children who could not be trusted to make their own decisions. Captain Nicole Wright commanded the carrier Freedom, which was the largest and most advanced ship in the human fleet. Nicole was 42 years old and had spent half her life in space. She had helped design the Freedom, had overseen its construction, had trained its crew personally. The ship was not just a military vessel to her. It was a statement about what humans could accomplish when they refused to accept limitations. When Nicole received her orders to take the Freedom to New Terra, she gathered her crew and gave them one chance to leave. Not a single person took it. The 12 human ships arrived at Epsilon Eridani after 3 days of faster-than-light travel. The Council fleet was positioned in a blockade formation around New Terra. 300 warships arranged in concentric spheres that covered every possible approach to the planet. The human fleet was outnumbered 25-1, and every tactical analysis said they had no chance of victory in a direct engagement. But Nicole had no intention of fighting directly. She broadcast a message on all channels that every ship in the system could hear, including the ones on both sides of the blockade. Nicole said that the human fleet was not there to start a war but to end a policy of fear. She said that the Council could maintain peace through cooperation or through intimidation, but not through both. She said that humanity would rather fight and lose than accept permanent isolation from the community of intelligent species. And then she said something that made every Council captain check their tactical displays in confusion. She said that if the Council fleet wanted to attack, they should do it now, because in about 30 seconds they would learn why the Council had banned alliances with humans in the first place. The Council fleet opened fire, and the Battle of New Terra began. The first wave of Council fire lit up the darkness of space like a thunderstorm made of pure energy. Plasma bolts and particle beams streaked toward the human fleet from 100 different angles, enough concentrated firepower to vaporize a small moon. But when the weapons reached where the human ships had been, they found nothing but empty space and electronic ghosts. The 12 human vessels had scattered, in a pattern that looked random but was actually carefully calculated chaos designed to confuse targeting systems that expected enemies to maintain formation and follow predictable tactics. Captain Nicole Wright stood on the bridge of the Freedom and watched her tactical display light up with threat indicators. There were so many red symbols showing enemy positions that the screen looked like it was bleeding. Her tactical officer, Lieutenant Greg Parker, called out incoming fire vectors in a calm voice that came from years of training and simulation. But this was not a simulation, and everyone on the bridge knew that one mistake would mean death for all 400 crew members aboard the Freedom. Nicole gave orders in short, quick bursts that her crew executed without hesitation. The carrier launched every small craft it carried, hundreds of drones that were not weapons but decoys equipped with transmitters that made them look like full-sized ships on enemy sensors. The Council fleet suddenly found itself tracking not 12 targets but 700, and their automated targeting systems began cycling through options trying to determine which signals were real and which were false. Lieutenant Commander Ben Carter commanded the destroyer Relentless, the smallest ship in the human fleet but also the fastest. Ben was 29 years old and had a reputation for taking risks that other officers thought were insane. His crew loved him because those risks usually paid off, and today he was planning the biggest risk of his career. He aimed his ship directly at the Council flagship, a massive dreadnought that was 3 times the size of the Freedom and bristling with enough weapons to fight an entire fleet by itself. The Relentless accelerated toward the flagship with its shields down and weapons powered off. Every sensor on the Council ship registered the Relentless as either disabled or surrendering. The Council captain held fire, probably assuming that the human ship had been damaged or that its crew had lost their nerve. Ben counted down the seconds in his head, watching the distance close on his display. 3 kilometers, 2 kilometers, 1 kilometer. At 500 meters, Ben redirected every available bit of power to the engines and weapons simultaneously. A maneuver that should have blown out half the systems on the ship but somehow held together long enough for the Relentless to rake the flagship's bridge section with railgun fire at point-blank range. The flagship's shields absorbed most of the damage, but the surprise attack forced the massive ship to divert resources to defensive systems. More importantly, it made the Council fleet hesitate for just a moment, uncertain if other human ships were planning similar suicide runs. That moment of hesitation was exactly what Nicole needed. She ordered the entire human fleet to execute Pattern Delta, which was a tactical formation that had been developed specifically for fighting larger forces. The 12 ships converged on a single section of the Council blockade, concentrating their fire on the shields of 6 enemy vessels simultaneously. On New Terra's surface, Governor Mike Santos and Chief Engineer Dana Foster were not sitting idle while the battle raged above them. Dana had spent the past 3 days preparing the colony's defenses, and now it was time to see if her modifications would actually work under combat conditions. The mining lasers that had been used to cut through rock and extract minerals were now aimed at the sky, their targeting systems locked onto Council ships that had descended into lower orbit to provide close support for the blockade. Dana gave the order to fire, and 12 mining lasers shot beams of concentrated energy into space. The beams were not as powerful as military-grade weapons, but they were precise and they were numerous. 7 Council ships took direct hits before their captains even realized they were under fire from the surface. Shields flickered and failed on 3 of the vessels, forcing them to retreat to higher orbit where the mining lasers could not reach them. The other 4 ships tried to return fire, but Dana had positioned the lasers near the colony's main shield generators, and the defensive fields absorbed the incoming attacks. The battle had been going on for 90 minutes when the first major shift happened. Ambassador Lisa Grant, who was still on the council station 4 light-years away, activated a signal she had been holding as a last resort. That signal reached out to every sympathetic species representative she had been secretly meeting with for the past 6 months. The message was simple. If you want change, act now or accept that the council will never change. 40% of the council fleet at Epsilon Eridani suddenly stopped fighting. Crevely ships powered down their weapons and withdrew to neutral positions. Chirax vessels broadcast messages saying they would not fire on civilians. Lumen ships simply turned around and started flying away from the battle. A dozen other species followed, each making their own decision that the quarantine of humanity was not worth fighting for. The council fleet went from overwhelming superiority to barely outnumbering the human forces, and more importantly, the unified front that had made the council so powerful for 3,000 years shattered in front of everyone watching. Commander Velthar watched his fleet fall apart from the bridge of his flagship, the same flagship that still had scorch marks from the relentless attack. He had been a council commander for 60 years and had never seen anything like this. Species that had been allies for centuries were now refusing orders. Ships that had fought together in a dozen campaigns were now on opposite sides of a battle line. And at the center of it all were humans, a species that had barely reached the stars and somehow managed to do in 6 months what no one had done in 3 millennia, which was to make the council question its own authority. Velthar made a decision that he knew would probably end his career, but might save thousands of lives. He ordered his flagship to charge its main weapon, a graviton pulse cannon that could crack a planet's crust and kill everyone on the surface. If he could not maintain the blockade, he would remove the reason for the blockade. New Terra would be destroyed and humanity would learn that defiance of the Council had consequences that could not be avoided. The weapon began charging, and every sensor in the system detected the energy buildup. It would take 90 seconds for the cannon to reach full power, and then New Terra would die. The Council ships that had remained loyal moved to protect the flagship, forming a defensive screen that the human fleet would have to break through to stop the weapon. Nicole saw what was happening and knew she had maybe 1 minute to do something impossible. She did not hesitate or call for volunteers or give a speech about sacrifice. Nicole simply ordered her helmsman to set a collision course with the Council flagship and told her crew to evacuate to the escape pods. Her officers protested, but Nicole made it an order. 400 people were not going to die if she could prevent it, but someone had to stop that weapon and she was the only one in position to do it. The crew of the Freedom abandoned ship in a stream of escape pods that scattered in every direction. Nicole sat alone on the bridge of her ship and guided it toward the flagship with hands that were perfectly steady. The Council fleet fired everything they had at the Freedom, and the carrier's shields started failing section by section. The ship shook and groaned and pieces of it began tearing away, but Nicole kept it on course. She whispered an apology to the Freedom, to the ship she had helped build and had loved like it was alive. Then the carrier hit the flagship's ventral section at full speed. The Freedom broke apart on impact, its structural integrity failing as it crashed into shields and armor that were designed to withstand anything except a capital ship ramming at maximum velocity. But the impact disrupted the graviton cannon's firing sequence, causing a feedback loop that shut down the weapon and left the flagship dead in space. Nicole died in the collision, but her sacrifice gave the human fleet the opening they needed. The remaining 11 Earth ships concentrated their fire on the disabled flagship, punching through its weakened shields and forcing Velthar to order an evacuation. The Council fleet retreated, not because they had been defeated, but because they no longer had the unity needed to continue fighting. The Battle of New Terra ended not with a clear victor, but with something that scared the Council far more than any military defeat. It ended with proof that humans could not be intimidated, could not be isolated, and could inspire other species to question 3,000 years of established order. The galaxy would never be the same, and the Council knew it. The aftermath of the Battle of New Terra sent shockwaves through the entire galaxy that had nothing to do with weapons or explosions. 18 species formally announced their withdrawal from the Galactic Council within the first week after the battle ended. and another 30 species threatened to follow if major reforms were not implemented immediately. The institution that had maintained peace and order for 3,000 years was collapsing, not because it had been conquered by force, but because its own members no longer believed in the principles it claimed to represent. Ambassador Velthar found himself in an impossible position. His flagship had been crippled, his fleet had fractured, and his authority had been undermined by his own decision to use the graviton cannon on a civilian colony. The council recalled him to the station and convened an emergency tribunal to determine whether he had acted appropriately. But the tribunal quickly became less about Velthar and more about the entire policy toward humanity. Species that had voted for the alliance ban now questioned whether it had been the right decision. Species that had opposed the ban demanded answers about why their concerns had been ignored. Captain Lisa Grant watched the council tear itself apart from her observer platform, and she felt no satisfaction in it. She had not wanted to destroy the council or prove that it was corrupt or incompetent. She had only wanted humanity to be treated as equals rather than as threats. But the council had built its entire structure on the assumption that all member species had reached a point of stability and wanted nothing more than to maintain that stability forever. When humanity appeared and challenged that assumption, the entire foundation cracked. Velthar himself called for the emergency summit that would decide the galaxy's future. He had aged visibly in the weeks since the battle, and when he spoke to the assembled representatives, his voice carried none of its former certainty. He admitted that the council had made mistakes in how it handled first contact with humanity. He admitted that the alliance ban had been based more on fear than on rational policy, and he admitted something that shocked everyone listening, which was that he personally had come to believe that the galaxy needed what humans offered, even if it made everyone uncomfortable. Lisa arrived at the summit with a delegation that included Governor Mike Santos, who had become a symbol of human determination after refusing to abandon New Terra. Colonel Kevin Shaw came as well, representing the military forces that had proven humans could fight when necessary, but preferred not to if given the choice. And Dr. Henry Blake came because he had been right from the beginning about what the council truly feared. And now his insights were needed more than ever. The summit lasted for 3 weeks with debates that sometimes grew so heated that security had to intervene to prevent physical confrontations between species that had been allies for centuries. The fundamental question being argued was simple but had profound implications. Should the galaxy be organized around maintaining stability or around encouraging growth? For 3,000 years the council had chosen stability, and that choice had brought unprecedented peace and prosperity. But it had also brought stagnation, and many species were finally admitting that stagnation had a cost they were no longer willing to pay. Dr. Henry Blake gave a presentation to the assembled species that used humanity, his own history as an example. He showed them how human civilizations had risen and fallen throughout the centuries, how each collapse had seemed like the end of the world to the people living through it, but how each collapse had also cleared the way for new ideas and new ways of organizing society. He showed them human art and music and literature that celebrated change even when change was painful. And he showed them data proving that human technological advancement had accelerated specifically during periods of social upheaval, rather than during periods of stability. The Chirax ambassador, a being that communicated through rapid clicking sounds that were translated into text on displays throughout the chamber, responded to Henry's presentation with observations that made many council members uncomfortable. The Chirax pointed out that when they had studied human culture, they had found countless stories about individuals who changed the world, about underdogs who won against impossible odds, about tomorrow being better than today. These stories were not just entertainment, the Chirax explained. They were a fundamental part of how humans understood their place in the universe. Humans genuinely believed that progress was possible, that problems could be solved, that things could always be improved. The Chirax ambassador then asked a question that no one wanted to answer. When was the last time any council species had told a story about an individual changing their entire civilization? When was the last time any species had created art that imagined a future radically different from the present? When was the last time anyone had looked at a system that worked adequately and asked if it could work better? The silence that followed lasted for almost a full minute. The vote on whether to dissolve the alliance ban took 3 days because every species wanted to make speeches explaining their position. Some argued that humanity had proven themselves through the Battle of New Terra and deserved full acceptance into galactic society. Others argued that humanity had proven themselves to be exactly as dangerous as the Council had feared and should be isolated even more strictly than before. But most species fell somewhere in the middle, acknowledging that change was necessary but uncertain about how much change they were willing to accept. When the votes were finally counted, the alliance ban was dissolved by a margin of 32 species in favor and 15 species opposed. But that vote was only the beginning. The Council also passed a measure creating what they called the Open Alliance Initiative, which was essentially a parallel structure to the Council that welcomed species interested in more dynamic cooperation. Member species of the Council could also join the Open Alliance if they wanted to, and species could leave either organization without penalty. President Allen Hughes addressed Earth from the White House in a speech that was broadcast across the entire solar system and transmitted to every human colony and outpost among the stars. He said that humanity had not sought conflict with the Galactic Council, but had not backed down when conflict came. He said that the ban on alliances had been unjust, but its dissolution was not a victory because the goal had never been to defeat the Council. The goal had been to prove that fear was a poor foundation for any civilization. Whether that civilization consisted of one species or 47, the wreckage of the Freedom was recovered from orbit around New Terra and transported back to the colony's surface where it was preserved as a monument. Captain Nicole Wright's sacrifice had saved 16,000 lives on the surface and had given humanity the time needed to prove that they would not surrender their freedom even when facing impossible odds. Every species in the galaxy learned her name, and 17 different civilizations created their own monuments honoring her memory. Governor Mike Santos continued leading New Terra, but the colony was no longer an isolated outpost that existed despite Council disapproval. It became the capital of the Open Alliance, a place where any species could come to work with others who believed that the future should be different from the past. The colony grew from 16,000 residents to over 2 million within 5 years, becoming a melting pot of cultures and ideas that the galaxy had not seen in millennia. Ambassador Velthar had several private conversations with Lisa Grant in the months after the summit, and in one of those conversations he finally explained the full truth that the Council had been hiding. The ban on human alliances had never been about protecting the galaxy from human violence or aggression. It had been about protecting Council species from feeling inadequate. When the Council studied humanity, they saw a species that still believed improvement was possible, that still took risks, that still dreamed of achieving things that seemed impossible, and that belief made every Council species look at their own civilizations and wonder why they had stopped trying to be better. Lisa understood then that the battle humanity had fought was not really against the Council but against complacency. The galaxy had been comfortable for so long that it had forgotten discomfort was necessary for growth. Humans had reminded everyone that progress required risk, that achievement required effort, and that the most dangerous thing any civilization could do was decide they had reached their final form and needed to change nothing more. 10 years after first contact, the galaxy was fundamentally different. Human cultural exports had spread to thousands of worlds, not because they were superior to alien cultures, but because they carried ideas that had been dormant in many species for generations. Other civilizations began creating their own stories about change and progress. Innovation accelerated across Council space at rates that had not been seen since the Council was first formed. New technologies emerged that combined knowledge from multiple species in ways that none of them could have achieved alone. Children on Earth looked up at the stars and knew they were welcome out there. The ban had been lifted, the restrictions removed, and humanity had earned its place in galactic civilization not through conquest or intimidation, but through example. They had shown the galaxy that fear of what might happen was more limiting than any external restriction could ever be. They had proven that the most powerful force in the universe was not advanced technology or ancient wisdom, but simple, stubborn hope that refused to accept that things could not be better. The Galactic Council still existed and would continue existing for thousands of years more, but it was no longer the only voice in galactic affairs, and it was no longer organized solely around maintaining what already existed. The Council had banned alliances with humans because they were afraid, and that fear had been justified in ways they never expected. Humans were dangerous, but not in the way the Council had imagined. They were dangerous to stagnation, dangerous to complacency, dangerous to the comfortable lie that good enough was the same as the best possible, and the galaxy, whether it wanted to admit it or not, needed that kind of danger.